Hello.
Hi,
So how are you?
I'm okay. How about you?
Uh, good, I guess. I've been preaching the good book for these days quite a bit.
In what way?
Well, I have a colleague who was planning on writing something and she was trying her hand at writing in English, and
Mm-hmm.
somebody had given her the feedback that she'd better read a little bit in English first before tackling writing. So she came to me because I have books in English, and she was saying she wants something small, not something big. And of course, my first recommendation was the Porcelain and Coral Brooch novellas. So what else? And I tempted her with Crackpot Trail. I told her it's the most beautiful metaphor I've ever seen for the artist and the condition of the artist and, art in general. She was quite intrigued.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I bet you would be.
And I have a new girl in training. She started 2 days ago, and I gave her 1 whole hour and 40 minutes before I preached Malazan to her.
Right, you're restraining yourself, were you?
Well, my colleagues were quite impressed with my power of restraint. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
she did make the mistake of saying she's into fantasy. So
Ah, well, that will do it. That opens the door, doesn't it?
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So let's get started.
Sure.
Um, I was watching AP's video on Deadhouse Gates, and he mentioned the season of rot, and that was something I've also been thinking about. He thought of it as a calamity because in the text it says that it came an unprecedented third time, I think, in the past 7 years or something of the sort.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking of it a little bit in different terms, as in, if you think of old religions, every god and every religion had an annual celebration. And even these days, if you think of Diwali, for example, in Hinduism, it's not a fixed date for celebration. It gets
Mm-hmm.
calculated according to certain omens or astrology or
Yeah.
different different reasons for it. So I was thinking, Hood would also have some sort of festival dedicated to him and to his worship, which would be, of course, predicted and calculated according to certain omens. So perhaps
Mm-hmm.
it's not so much a calamity as maybe, one of the normal events for the cult of Hood. How did you?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I like that notion that there aren't fixed dates. The whole idea of kind of a universally set calendar is um, it's a conceit for our world, but it probably would not be relevant to the Malazan world. So you can't really fix a date in that respect. Not if you have a religion that extends beyond the Malazan Empire, beyond a specific culture or civilization. Um, but I was also thinking in terms of climate change. We have two major sort of climatic events that affect Canada, especially here on the west coast. Actually, it has an effect everywhere, but it's called El Nino and El Nino. Um, and as the climate is becoming more disrupted, we're getting more of these events. So that's probably some aspect of it because one of the background elements, even in Deadhouse Gates, that's already started is the collapse of Omtos Falak, and so the the artificial ice ages are coming to an end, and so that's disrupting climate everywhere. So the season of rot is simply a climatic condition that basically um, brings pestilence, if you will. And of course, seasons like that, one can easily apply to uh, notions of um, the god of death and decay, um, and the end of things, and plagues of flies, just like plagues of locusts, this kind of thing. These things are always attributed to something, and so it's probably the inspiration for it. But of course, in the Malazan world, the gods are real, and so they they're tipping the hat. And Hood certainly, in a sense, pays a visit in the prologue of Deadhouse Gates, so which foreshadows, the rest of the book.
I was actually thinking, because this manifestation of Hood tells Heboric, I have a secret to tell you, and then he comes near and then just vanishes. So I was wondering what that secret is. Was he trying to give him a hint about Fener's impending fall, or was it just some sort of intimidation?
It's a kind of, no, it's a walking metaphor. I mean, the figure of flies that has nothing at the center. It's kind of a, it's kind of mocking the pretensions of the belief systems, specifically Heboric's, or his lack thereof. Don't forget, he's an ex-priest, so his faith is gone, and so his belief system is such that there is nothing at the center, there is nothing at the core, and so that's what he has shown.
Well, about Heboric and his faith, I always had this feeling that he is struggling with the fact that he both lacks and has his faith at the same time. He seems devoted to Fener, he seems loyal, but yet at the same time he doesn't quite believe. And this internal conflict is what's actually grinding him.
Sure, like with any religion, you've got the sacred side and you've got the secular side, and he's been betrayed by the secular side, and so that undermines his faith in the sacred side. So in that respect, yeah, he's certainly in turmoil, or in conflict of some form. And as a writer, you always want your characters in some kind of conflict internally. And so that sort of places him where I wanted him, I guess, at the beginning of the book. Felicin is the character that is unformed at the beginning and then is given shape throughout the book. But in order for that to actually work, you need characters around that person who are fully formed, if you will, with their backgrounds and their histories. And then that kind of, it almost presents options for the path Felicin can take. And of course, in this case, she chooses none of them. She's presented with Bodin. I suspect, in some ways, she probably is heading on the path of Bodin more than she is Heboric. But they're both there as options, if you will, in terms of how to deal with the outside world. And in some ways, she deals with her situation almost as a version similar to what Bodin does in terms of how he interacts with the outside world. And it's kind of, there is a little bit of a parallel going on there as well. So, which is why she doesn't get along with Bodin.
Mm-hmm. In Gardens of the Moon, you just let it slip discreetly that Genoa's Paran has family, and we get to see them briefly, Tavor and Felicin both, along with the captain of the guard, a certain Gamut.
Mm-hmm.
Then we see more of Felicin in Deadhouse Gates and more of Tavor and Gamut in House of Chains. And in a similar way, you slip Timbre in Deadhouse Gates, almost unnoticeable. She's just standing there by the side of Tavor, and then we see her later in The Bone Hunters. And would it be safe to assume that at this point she wasn't possessed yet by the Aresal?
Hard to say. I don't think I ever decided when the possession occurred. So, yeah, probably not. Probably not. She's simply there for Tavor.
Now, the next one is actually a quote. People of civilized countenance made much of exposing the underbellies of their psyche. Effete and sensitive were the brands of finer breeding. It was easy for them, safe, and that was the whole point after all. a statement of coddled opulence that burned the throats of the poor more than any ostentatious show of wealth. Is this, in a way, a reflection on the difference between the rich countries and the poor ones in our world? That it's not so much the fact that the richer countries live a better life, but this sensitivity and frailness that people display so boldly that annoys the people who don't have it?
Possibly, yeah. Privilege shows itself in many ways, and so, and of course, one of the issues that we're all facing is that we are raised within a cultural context, and if that context is privileged, we don't even notice the privilege that we're experiencing. Which then, if the necessities of survival are not, front and foremost, then it does allow, I guess, in some respects, people to become more concerned about the frivolous things as opposed to those elements of survival. So yeah, it's a very sort of generalized comment. I think you can apply pretty much anywhere.
All right. The call of the nobility. AP was saying in his video that it served to cut the power of the nobles who had infiltrated every institution and were plotting and vying for power. And that is likely one of the purposes of the call. It's the obvious, most important one, perhaps. Yet there was one detail that really caught my attention: the way in which it was done. The nobles were brought before a mock-up court with a drunk magistrate, a jury of beggars, and then there was the public display. The way that they were taken to the ships, and the fact that the mobs were allowed to attack them and tear them limb from limb, as if, in a way, Lassini needed the support of the public, and she used the nobility to, here's your enemy, have fun with it, love me for it.
Yeah.
In a way, it's reminding perhaps of the way the Roman emperors dealt with angry mobs.
Yep, same kind of thing. Crystal knocked as well. I mean, it's a common method is to find the enemy within, and to paint it in bright colors and then set the mob loose. Sure. Yeah, very common in history.
During the wandering through the Penpozzuno Dan, Mappo notices the remnants of destroyed cities, close enough to each other to suggest that their civilization must have been a thriving one. And he then asks himself if perhaps the destruction of the civilization might have had something to do with the birth of the myth of Drishna the Apocalyptic. Do we see in Mappo's wandering the scientific approach of the historian with regards to the birth of religion and the way in which big events shape the evolution of religious beliefs of the people affected by them?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, rise and falls of civilizations or cultures. That's something both Cam and I are. That was our interest. That was our academic interest as well. And if you walk ruins, if you've been to sites like that, at least for me, and I'm sure for Cam, it just conjures up sort of speculation as to how these things rise and fall, and so you're looking. I don't know. In some ways, I've got, or even then, I had kind of a counter notion regarding cultural evolution, where when it's taught in class, or when it was taught, I don't know if this is the case now, but there was an implicit value system that was tied to progress, and progress as being implicitly a good thing, and a beneficial thing. And I always kind of thought, well, it didn't really make sense because osteologically, for example, you can see that agriculture actually its advent was kind of damaging to the human physique. Didn't live as long. Um, the teeth got worse. Things like rheumatism and arthritis increased. And yeah, you can argue that that's sedentarianism and having, livestock. It's all contributing to sort of that ill health, but also the labor involved, the intensity of the labor involved. So it never struck me that agriculture, the arrival of agriculture, was actually something willfully chosen. I think we were forced. We were backed into the corner when the populations became extensive enough to actually thin out the wildlife in whatever region you're in. You either start planting things or you starve. And so I never sort of viewed it as kind of progress, but rather as adaptation to in the face of necessity. So, when I look at ruins and stuff like that, and think of that early shift away from what was probably a pretty egalitarian, fairly good lifestyle into something that then involved hierarchy and enforced labor and long periods of planting, harvesting, creation of surplus, all the things that sort of give rise to city states and to civilization. They weren't good for the majority of people. They were good for the people in charge. They weren't good for anybody else, and that hasn't changed. I mean, that continues to this day. And so these things are always sort of swirling around, kind of behind everything that Cam and I were writing and talking about and gaming in the fantasy world. And so in that sense, I guess we were always inclined to undermine the assumptions of progress. And so when we're writing in the seven cities and you've got all this remnant civilizations, those questions are going to come to the fore for characters who are inclined to think that way. So long answer, but there it is.
This next one actually is not mine. It was posted today on the Malazan Empire by Scott Defoe. He was saying that he was in the middle of another reread of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and something familiar struck him about Krupp, as if he has seen this character before. He was saying that it wasn't until a few books later that he realized what the connection was. And he thinks that Krupp is very similar to Wimpy from the Popeye cartoons, that both are similarly dismissed as buffoons, mainly due to their slovenly appearance, gluttonous appetites, and apparent laziness, but in reality are quite intelligent and cunning, and both can be summarized as con artists. They both have a penchant for red clothing, waistcoat for Krupp and tie for Wimpy, and he was wondering whether this was intentional, subconscious, or just coincidence on your part.
If it was anything, it would be subconscious. Man, as a kid, I grew up watching, believe it or not, they actually used to show the black and white Popeye on television at the end of the school day. You'd come home and you could see some of these really, really old black and white Popeye cartoons. And they were fun. But I don't really think in terms of, all I remember about Wimpy was standing around and he's eating hamburgers. So in that sense, I don't know if I really ever absorbed any of his personality traits when watching this stuff. I was too young anyways. So yeah, I there's definitely not a conscious tip of the hat to Wimpy, but Krupp was just generated in fairly early gaming, where I wanted to come up with an unusual character, not your standard cleric or mage or fighter or thief, or I just wanted something just a little bit different. And Krupp just sort of popped into my head, and I role played him and built him up from there.
Well, you definitely succeeded. And I think that Krupp and Iskralpus should definitely be brothers. They are quite similar
Yeah.
from my point of view. And Tehol next. The three of them sort of fit together. Uh, the Aptorian demon, Apt.
Mm.
How strong is she? I believe at some point we get to find out she's actually a queen of the Aptorian demons, not just any demon. Because we keep seeing these wolves that attack her, but the wolves are not just any wolves. That's actually Rinandaras in his wolf shape.
Mm-hmm.
And she keeps him at bay without a sweat.
Mm.
That was cool, actually. I mean, even Karsa had a hard time with Rilandaras.
Yeah. I kind of sort of kept my distance from Rilandaris because I knew Cam was going to be approaching that character in far more detail. So if there were going to be clashes, they weren't going to be definitive in any fashion.
I think that's probably the coolest Soltegan and diverse ever, because he exists in both forms, both animal and humanoid.
Mm.
And on two different continents at the same time. It's an amazing concept. We all know that exposure to Otataral drives mages mad. Yet Duiker launches a hypothesis that I, for one, have never seen discussed by the fans, and that's that it might not be Otataral that drives them mad, but rather the prolonged severance from their warren. If you were to take a guess, which one would you say is more likely?
I don't know. Cam explored it, with fingers in the mines, and I'm trying to remember now how he sort of messed around with that. It's hard for me to separate the gaming from what he wrote because I played Fingers and Blues as members of the Crimson Guard, as well as Skinner and Shimmer. But Fingers was always kind of half mad anyways. So maybe that Cam sort of took that and just thought he could come up with a good reason for it. And that's probably where that notion of the Otataral driving mages mad came from. I don't know for sure. A lot of what we did with our gaming was to riff off what the other person had set up. And each of us had complete freedom to do that. And that riff would be generated by the desire to actually knock the other person askew, knock them off stride, and catch them by surprise. And so it was like this constant passing back and forth of various challenges in the gaming, and coming up with something that would be unexpected for the other person. And of course, we were both fairly jaded fantasy readers, and so we'd seen all the cliches and all the tropes, and so it was always that kind of challenge to come up with something completely unexpected for the other person. And I know when Cam tackled Fingers and Blues, especially Fingers, it was great because it was like seeing this character doing things that caught me off guard and caught me by surprise. It was good fun.
All right. I still remember when I first started reading Deadhouse Gates, I was just a little bit disappointed to see that, new continent, new characters, start the whole work from the beginning, getting to know new people. But all that changed with the scene of the arrival of the Wiccans at Hisar Docks. That scene was amazing. And, first this display of crazy, violent, or untrained warriors just bursting through, and then the display of, what's the word, disciplined warriors, just one whistle and everybody, even the horses responded to that. And Coltane just waving his knife above and being all crazy. And I was wondering, why did he do that?
Well, it's a display, and it's a display that feeds into the fears and expectations. You know, they are the other. They are the immigrants. They are the savages. They are the barbarians. They are all these things, and so there's a huge sort of element of expectation in terms of the populace and what they're witnessing, and so he gives it to them. And then he shows that it's all rubbish because, you know, that one whistle and everything just shuts down. I mean, it's all a demonstration. It's all a display. And it's all basically a warning that those expectations or those belief systems are completely unfounded. And then he proceeds to show everyone just how unfounded. So
That, and perhaps also building some sort of reputation, because later on, when
mm-hmm.
Duiker goes around spying, one of the locals tells him that uh, a man with a demon's face commands the Malazans, and that even the Meslas fear him.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually helps with the morale of your enemy. If they think that you're larger than life, then the first battle is won.
Mm-hmm. And of course, if you think of the rest of the book, it turns out that Colton and the Wiccans are the most civilized of the entire lot, of any of them. So, yeah.
Perhaps a different view of the uncivilized savage.
Mm. Yeah.
You rarely choose your words randomly. And there's something about snakes that keeps appearing. Like in the scene where Duiker and his small group watch the arrival of Coltane, Molly Krell first calls the continent a viper nest. Then 2 pages later, the captain calls Coltane a snake. And just even a little bit later, during the meeting, Duiker advises Coltane, and then he wonders whether or not he was wise and safe in doing such a thing. And he thinks of Coltane as reminding of a cobra rising before him, unblinking, cold. And I think there's too much of Snake for it to be random. You are trying to say something, and I just couldn't get it.
Well, I mean, it's one tends to, at least I tend to, I'll choose similes and metaphors that suit the environment. And so, you know, we're in a semi-arid and arid environment where if there is sort of a natural threat, it will be usually in venomous snakes and scorpions and spiders, I suppose. So think Australia, you know. So, but anyways, snakes. Well, okay. I mean, there are other subtextual elements going on here because, you know, we are heading towards a fairly, or rather, an exploration of the Christian motif of crucifixion, which is coming at the end of the book. And so there will be sort of, I guess, very sort of sly biblical references running all the way through. And certainly snakes seen as a bringer of knowledge is something I was probably subconsciously messing around with. Don't forget, we're talking, how long ago was this? This is a long time ago that I wrote this. But I knew what my final scenes of the book were. So there's all kinds of elements that I probably was consciously and aware of slipping in there that just sort of added something in terms of unifying my vision of what I was heading towards and the things I wanted to echo. You know, for me, I mean, fantasy novels, I want them to echo this world. I don't want them to be completely distinct and separate. I think fantasy novels are a great vehicle to comment on our world with a certain level of freedom that you don't find in any other genre. So if snakes keep reappearing, then I don't think you're right. It's probably not accidental, but I was certainly also, I mean, the first thing I would answer was, that I'm tying it to the environment. And so that was probably my first reason for doing so. But then keeping it there would be all that subtextual stuff that's going on.
This next one is actually one of my favorites because it feels to me like you were teasing us with cryptic information in Deadhouse Gates probably more than any other book. So Duker goes out scouting, he witnesses a young seer apparently summoning Drijna, and the boy says something right before he dies. And there's a prophecy happening here. He says, two fountains of raging blood, face to face. The blood is the same, the two are the same, and salty waves shall wash the shores of Raraku. The holy desert remembers its past. And I remember thinking, there's something more than the obvious here. The obvious being, the Malazans, the seven cities, same blood, raging against each other, and salty waves, obviously the blood. But there had to be something more. And then after reading House of Chains, I thought that's when it comes. It's Tavor and Felicin.
Yeah.
And Raraku becoming a sea.
Mm-hmm.
And that was such a tease. Apparent nonsense of a young seer just saying something, babbling. So easy to miss.
Yeah.
The resurrection magic of the Wiccans. First, Duiker explains that the Rivi have a similar belief, and in that we are reminded of Silver Fox. He talks about escaping Hood's Gate, a soul escaping Hood's Gate by being reborn. And I had a really crazy question. The crows, they pick up the soul and then they deliver it to a pregnant woman who has a child that lacks a soul. If somehow by magic or just the crows would find a way to pick up Atlanimas's soul and deliver it to such a woman, into such a body, into a Mahib, would the child be born with the memories of the Tlanimas, or would it work like it works for the Wiccans? I know it's a crazy question.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, until Memories of Ice, the souls of the Tlanimas are pretty tightly bound within the ritual. Their memories, all of that kind of stuff. So it would depend on whether, I guess it'd be kind of a contest of efficacy between the ritual of Talan and the sorcery that the crows are part of in terms of that soul. I've never really considered one way or the other whether I can't think of any Tlanimas souls wandering around in a discorporeal fashion. The whole point is they're bound to that skeletal form, and so when the skeletal form can no longer walk, it's been shattered. The skull is just perched in the crotch of a tree, so it can look out on the vista for basically eternity, because it can't leave that. It can't leave its form. So in that respect, I'd have to say no. There are no Tlanimas souls floating around.
Well, my question was if the crows or any other magic would find a way to actually separate the soul from the. It would be something to see an old Tlanimas soul reborn in an infant's body with all its memories intact.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the question of whether memories are intact and stay intact is another thing, right? I don't know how much you've read in terms of accounts by psychologists and psychiatrists who talk about and have done interviews with children who appear to have experienced past lives. Their memories of those past lives don't last very long. They fade fairly quickly. So, but that's just something of interest I've read a few times. So
I used to have such memories as a child. They have
Yeah,
made
it's
it
I don't
mostly,
think
but
it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon. Yeah.
mm, for the most part, Lassine is heavily judged for murdering Dancer and Callanved. And there is a point that Bolt makes when Duiker asks why hasn't Lassine considered that killing them might affect her relationship with the other members of the group. Bolt says that Dancer and Callanved were able conquerors, but were they able rulers? And most fans see Lassine as an immoral traitor who killed the people who made the Empire great. And to my surprise, most of them fail to see that the Empire was a side effect of Kelanved's purpose and that they were driving it into the ground. And Lassine basically stepped in and stepped up to protect the Empire.
Yep. It's all down to perspective, isn't it? It's all down on you sort of where is the allegiance of the reader, and one can shape that allegiance very, very quickly in terms of choosing perspective. So Lassine is always the remote enemy. From the prologue of Gardens of the Moon, I mean, she's the threat. She's the dangerous one. And so, yeah, the reader, I guess, in a sense, will hold on to that notion. But I think, Cam deals with it very well, Return of the Crimson Guard. So
When my husband read The Return of the Crimson Guard, when he finished the book, he said, damn, I used to think that Lassini is bad, but now I'm feeling sorry for her. Now I
yeah,
realize
so
she
did I.
wasn't bad after all.
No, no.
On the same note, there's a comment that Duiker makes after the meeting that Lassine might regret her actions and that she probably feels the solitude of her power. And in the end, I believe that it was that solitude that led to the failing of her rule. And in a way, her generals sentenced her the day they chose to drown.
Mm, yeah. Of course, that idea of drowning is a bit of an in joke for me and Cam, anyways, in our gaming. Yeah, whenever we wanted to get drop a character off the board, as it were, they drowned. Yeah.
Uh, the scene ends with Duiker noticing that the office they hid in to have the conversation was the same where the previous fist had been assassinated, and he was wondering if that might be a bad omen for the attempt at rescuing Heboric. Was this foreshadowing for what would happen to their plan, and in particular to poor Culp?
Um, Probably. There's all kinds of sort of omen elements in the opening of Deadhouse Gates, because it's a culture that is fixated on omens. So once you're sort of immersed in that, then you start seeing them everywhere, and it seemed useful to make use of that in terms of what the characters are describing around them, and it conveys more of that ominous portent of things to come.
It sure did. At least the first time I read this little scene, and I was thinking something's gonna go bad, but how
Oh
bad?
yeah.
The last line in the scene is actually drew my attention. Culp is considering whether or not he should help put another treasonous historian in the world, and it's part humor in the joke, but it also carries a more serious meaning. What makes a historian a traitor?
Not well. Recording history um, without service to the agenda of those in power. Um, that would be deemed as treasonous. I mean, this happens in post-revolution in countries throughout modern history. The academics go right; they're the first ones strung up. Um, Artists are next, musicians, you name it, poets. Uh, Basically, anyone who's not going to toe the party line and simply follow whatever the whatever the rules of integrity that exist within their chosen field or profession or endeavor. Those are deemed as dangerous, and in many respects, I guess they are. They're dangerous to the tyrant, the dictator.
You know, I was considering more from the point of view as treason to whom and to what. You can betray your principles, you can betray your family by standing for your principles and ending up in jail. You can be a danger to the ones in power and then be labeled a traitor, even though you haven't really betrayed the truth. So there's so many facets to it.
Yeah, yeah.
Kimlock, he tells Fiddler that the bridge burners were honorable soldiers fighting a dishonorable war. But based on what we know of the cultures of seven cities, one could say with as much certainty as can be applied to such a complex topic, that the Malazans did a favor to the people of seven cities when they conquered them. Equally true, people will hate the yoke of a foreign culture no matter how much it may improve their lives. And while improving the lives of the locals was a side effect of the conquering and not the purpose, it is the end result that matters in the end. And I would have expected Kimlock to side with the Empire on this one. Would you agree with Kimlock's take that the war was dishonorable?
I don't know. I don't know. The thing is, when you sort of immerse yourself in a point of view as the writer, um, you reinterpret the scenario and the history and all the rest from that stance, from that point of view, and you just run with it. So, I mean, what's being dealt with here is the complexity of colonialism and the complexity of imperial conquest. It's not cut and dried. It's ambivalent. It's ambiguous. And it's more a case of what you choose to see in terms of whether you're going to, how that's going to shape your value system, and how you're going to judge history. So I think Kimlock is simply providing that other sort of side of things, that this is not simple, and it's a mistake actually to view it in a simple fashion. But Kimlock's got his own agenda, and just like everyone else, and so they're going to see things from their points of view. And in terms of any opinion I've got, I'm less interested in laying out a particular opinion, personal one. I'm more interested in, let's get as many opinions as possible out there from as many perspectives as possible, and the reader can decide where they want to weigh in on it.
My husband, he's Indian, and I see how he thinks of the British occupation period in India. On one side, all the financial ripping and the all the things that the Britishers took from India. On the other side, they also gave them infrastructure, and let's not mention ending the sati, the burning of the wife on the of the widow on the dead husband's pyre. So I know that he himself has different views on it. So it's
Yeah,
really a complicated theme.
it is complicated. Yeah.
And it plays into a bigger theme, and that's of the honor of the soldier and the dishonor of war. Is there such a thing as an as honorable war after all?
Um, I think so. I think there are certainly strong elements of, for example, the Second World War, where the Allies were, I guess, I don't know. It's hard to know. I mean, nationalism I find something very suspect to begin with, but at the same time, uh, if an ideology is making sort of false distinctions across the human species, so that these people are worthy and these people are not. I think that the notion of resisting that and objecting to it is a valid one. I mean, one can still look back and see just how quickly that nobility and that honor fell apart after the sort of the final fall of the Third Reich, because both sides were then busy stealing scientists and bringing them over, and regardless of whether they were SS or not. So regardless of their own historical legacy, it suddenly became a free-for-all to sort of get the best scientific minds. And so it's amazing how quickly those honorable purposes can be completely dismantled for expedience. Anyways, I guess I'm feeling cynical today. I don't know. It's funny. There were so many articles when lockdown first happened about a year ago, and the effect that this was actually going to enforce a fundamental change in our culture, in our civilization, in our society. And all I'm seeing right now is the previous status quo clawing its way back, and it's kind of depressing. So,
well, yo-yo effect. People, the yo-yo effect. People will get far from who they are for a while, but they always come back to what they know, to the comfort of the familiar, good or bad, it's comfortable.
Yeah, it just feels like a missed opportunity for sure.
How about the sorcery of the Tano spirit walkers? I mean, we know of the magic of the Folklore sale, the magic of the spoken word. And one might say that the magic of the Tano is that of music. But I think I saw it more as the magic of the sung word. Similar perhaps to the songs of the Imas. It reminds me of folklore and oral transmission and how information is passed on from generation to generation through songs.
Yeah, I mean, songs, just like poems, are great mnemonic devices, and so because they have built-in structure, and you can start loading that structure with information, and it can be very subversive because it can carry a lot of information, and quite often, it's subtle enough to pull it off without the authorities noticing. So it's language can do that. Language is powerful stuff. And of course, the shadow or the spirit walkers are foreshadowing the snake. Going all the way to the end of the series. That snake, not the snakes in this book.
I didn't think of it. Foreshadowing the snake. Later in the book, there's a conversation between Mappo and Icarium that I completely missed, and I was aware of the fact that I missed it the first time. And I only understood it after you shared an article about the Neanderthals and the evolution of language and the manner in which knowledge was stored before the invention of writing, and how writing in turn shaped the evolution of language once people didn't have to memorize most of the database, so to speak. And this is where I would like to quote Icarium. He says, "Writing replaces memory, you see, and the language itself changes because of it. Think of my mechanisms in which I seek to measure the passage of hours, days, years. Such measurings are by nature cyclic, repetitive. Words and sentences once possessed the same rhythms and could thus be locked into one's mind and later recalled with absolute precision. Perhaps," he mused after a moment, "if I was illiterate, I would not be so forgetful."
Yeah.
Go on.
Well, no, there are some very fascinating accounts of non-literate societies, almost up until the present day, where you have your version of historians, your storytellers, your bards, if you want to call them that, who can go on for days delivering a single epic poem, and it's all in their memory. It's all bound in there. I think the archaeologist, I don't know if he was an archaeologist, maybe a historian, Michael Wood, I think his name was. He wrote he did some television series, but he wrote some books called, one's called In Search of Alexander, another one's In Search of Troy. And he recounts being in a village in Afghanistan, and I think it's Afghanistan, and just witnessing one of these storytellers and just being absolutely blown away because, yeah, the memory locked into this one person was extraordinary. To tell a story that spans days is pretty impressive. And so then, he then speculates on how the brain is restructured by the written word. And I certainly didn't have any issues with that. I think we are restructured. We are different, and probably we're quite different from Bronze Age peoples in terms of how we saw the world and how we articulated internally. And I think the evidence of that is very clear if you compare the Iliad versus the Odyssey, because I think the Iliad captures more of the Bronze Age than the Odyssey. So.
Interesting. No, for some reason I was remembering a little bit of music history trivia. When Liszt went visiting Romania collecting folklore, he stopped at some inn in Moldova, and a local gypsy player happened to be there, just a violin player, and he played one of his symphonies on a piano, almost 2 hours worth of playing. And when he was done, the gypsy took up his violin and he basically adapted the whole piano symphony on his violin, 2 hours of copying the whole thing from beginning to the end. And Liszt was astounded. How can that happen from somebody who's illiterate, can't read or write, and has no musical education?
That's pretty impressive. Yeah, no kidding.
That's actually one thing that our local musicians usually envy the gypsy players, because unlike us, they don't get a musical education, they don't read music, they don't write, they have no knowledge whatsoever, but their memory and their skill is so impressive that none of our school can compete with them.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things. I mean, we keep narrowing the definition of education, and it's this immense desire to regiment it and to qualify it and to put numbers to it. But education occurs in countless forms. Some of the finest education is entirely nonverbal. It occurs in hunter-gatherer groups and the raising of children, and the fact that children are raised communally. They're taught by simply observing what other people are doing, what the older people are doing, and that's all that's needed. And they acquire their knowledge, and then they practice, and they're given the room to make mistakes and to continue practicing, and that is a form of education. It's probably one of the most crucial forms of education. But because we've quantified it to such an extent, or rather qualified it, whatever, we have this really narrow notion. And so, if somebody's not good with numbers, then they fail a year. It's like it's crazy. It's a really weird system we have. Basically designed to produce little soldiers, anyways. But education and the way cultures teach they're young, there's huge variety in that. And who's to say which is more valuable? So
our folklore teacher actually used to tease us. He used to say, us white people, we are so dismissive of the brown people, but if you look around, when it comes to us musicians, brown people kick our asses. So how about you shut up? He really enjoyed saying that to everybody who would listen. Um, at the end of Fiddler's visit, he has a conversation with his escort on his way out about Kimlock's decision to surrender to the Empire rather than fight it, a decision that had been made based on what the Tlanimas have done in Erin. To which Fiddler responds, rather irritated, that what happened in Erin was a mistake and that no order has been given to the Tlanimas. Why was he so certain about it? Because of Absalard having dancers' memories of them not giving the order, or did he know something that we, the reader, don't know?
probably all of the above. Dancer would certainly know. Remembering that Fiddler was second to Whiskey Jack when he was in power, higher ranks. So, but again, they're adamant about their position, and whether it's accurate or not is actually not really relevant. It's just this is what they hold on to. This is their truth.
Yeah, that makes sense. Icarium and his arrows. They say that Icarium's arrows have warrens carved in them, strong enough to take down a dragon. How do you carve a warren on an arrowhead or on the shaft, whatever?
It would be the shaft. It would
do
be
you,
the shaft.
do you inscribe a symbol that carries the magic of the warren, or is it more like attaching a mini black hole on the shaft?
It's probably more the former. It's the use of arcane symbols that have attached meaning to them. It's strange, I studied, one of my areas is rock art, and something you find all over the world in terms of carved into stone facing are, well, a number of things, but the one I was thinking was the spiral. The spiral is a recurrent iconic image in rock art. You'll find it in Scotland, Cornwall, North America, you name it. It's a carved spiral. And so I know some people try to sort of talk about the psychology of creating that shape, but I think there's probably a lot more to it. It's not just about repetition. There's something, or even aesthetics. There is something else involved. And so, as an anthropologist, you're looking at this kind of stuff. On the one hand, in terms of its cultural importance, but at the same time, I mean, I also did art. I did a lot of art, so I look at it as an artist as well when I looked at rock art. And I guess I just came away with a sense that there's a lot more to recurring imagery, recurring iconography than simply sort of a kind of a continuity of human nature and human physiology or neurology. And so, the idea of painting words of power or symbols of power onto the shaft of an arrow, just that kind of makes perfect sense to me. I don't have any issues with it. And if, in terms of what we did for our gaming, we had to deal with magic mechanics and how we were going to sort of play that out in our gaming. And rather than doing all the hand waving gestures and dancing in circles, I think we probably put a lot more emphasis on iconic symbols, symbology of some kind, or carvings, writings, that kind of thing. And it's a metaphor for the potency of written history, of the written word, anyways. So that was a long, convoluted response to that. But anyways.
It was a really cool response to that. Romanian clothes, traditional clothes, which we no longer wear, are heavily decorated, and usually, actually always, we use geometrical patterns and symbols.
Mm-hmm.
And women used to decorate their own clothes back in the day. And these days, you'll see them sold everywhere, just random symbols sewn on the blouses. But back when people still knew what the symbols meant, each symbol told a meaning or a word or a story, and they built stories on the blouses using the symbols. It was
Mm-hmm.
aesthetics.
Yeah, yeah. Barry Cunliffe has just done a book on the Scythians. It's a fantastic book, and it does a full analysis of not only the archaeology but the written histories from Herodotus and others on these horse cultures of Central Asia. And he goes into great detail on the description of the symbols, not just in the clothing, because a lot of the clothing is actually preserved, in these frozen ground, these kurgans, but also in rock art that's on the mounds. And yeah, it is fascinating stuff. I'm often quite alarmed sometimes when I see the use of certain tattoos, because it would strike me that tattoos are one of the most sort of potent self-adornment methods of all kind, of any, because the other stuff you can take on and off, tattoos you carry with you. And yeah, some things have some pretty dubious symbolic meaning, and there they are, sported on the arm or the shoulder. I don't know. And then if you think in terms of acupuncture, the last thing you want to do is ritually scarify your skin, because it impedes with the the energy flow of your chi or your prana. So I mean, I find it fascinating stuff. And I think I used tattooing very sort of circumspectly in the Malazan world. I think Cam probably used it a little bit more. But yeah, symbology, it's a fascinating subject for sure. I could go on for hours on it.
Okay, this is going to be a tough one. How do you feel about people making Malazan themed tattoos?
It always startles me that somebody would actually do that. Then, of course, my son has got Star Trek tattoos all over the place. So I could see it. I mean, it's as long as, the risk is always one day you may lose your loyalty for the Malazan world, in which case you're stuck with a tattoo that you're going to have to get removed.
I doubt that.
Well, I don't think that there's too much risk involved. If one were to speak esoterically, there's probably, there's not much risk involved with those kind of tattoos. The stuff that does catch me by surprise is the stuff related to sort of the arcane belief systems of Europe, especially. Some of those tattoos just don't. Why are you wearing that? But anyways, that's just a personal thing on my part. But yeah, I'm thinking, what have I seen? I've seen bridge burner tattoos.
Anomander
and of course, which one?
Anomander Rake.
Anomander Rake. I've not seen that.
The whole, I think I saw one guy having the whole, there's that, I think, there's this image of Anomander looking back with the sword on his
Yeah,
back.
from the sub press.
Had it on his whole back, shoulder to waist.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Wow. Well, I mean, it's a great image. It's an amazing painting, for sure.
Well, I've never been into tattoos. The idea of something permanent is a little too scary. A temporary tattoo, that would work, but nothing permanent. I'm good with the way Mother Nature made me.
Yeah, I was in an acupuncture, it was about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, 2 years ago now. And the instructor, or the person, acupuncturist, she wanted to work on a couple of fencing scars I've got where a foil has broken and basically stabbed me. And so I've got one sort of right here, and then I've got one on my leg. And the one on my leg was during a tournament, and it went about an inch in, and it was an electric blade. So the exposed wire gave me this tremendous electric shock. And that was when I was probably 20 years old. And so she was trying to sort of get the needles going in around the scar, and then finally zeroing in, spiral pattern actually, onto the scar itself. And I wasn't noticing anything going on. I was just lying there on my back, eyes closed. And then when she finally put the needle in the center of the scar, I got the entire electric shock all over again. And I just jolted on the bed. And she said, well, that's not surprising, because the scar holds the memory of the injury. And that has stuck with me. And I'm probably going to use that somewhere in my fiction, somewhere. The notion of, those scars actually holding that memory somehow, maybe in a quantum sense, just locked in there. But yeah, I got the entire injury just repeated itself right there. It was pretty amazing.
It actually is.
Yeah.
Somehow it reminds me of, I've always had performance anxiety. And I remember I was 7th or 8th grade, about to give my annual piano exam. And my sister was there just holding my hands, really, really scared, because if I didn't get a 10, there would be trouble at home. And then my piano teacher came and said, you know what, don't touch her. Take your hands off, do not touch her. Because nerve endings, emotions can be transmitted through touch. And if you're scared and you're holding her hands, you're just making her more afraid. So take your hands off.
Interesting, yeah.
That,
it's funny. There's a lot of, I think, fairly valid belief systems out there that are not bound to the Western style of medicine. And it's so annoying when I hear people dismiss that kind of stuff so quickly. They really don't have a leg to stand on when they're doing that. It's just the assumptions that they're carrying. Yeah, I've seen some pretty amazing stuff in when with and in other cultures and observing things. So yeah, I can see that.
It's probably the tendency to generalize, because even if I look at our own traditional medicine, some stuff works and it's real, and some stuff is just sheer bogus. And you have to be able to tell which one is which, but to dismiss all of it upfront seems like a missed opportunity.
Yeah. But I mean, the whole West is sort of bound into this mechanistic universe idea, and it dismisses a lot of things that cannot be measured or quantified. So I don't know. It's like blinding yourself in one eye. Why? And then imagining that what you see is all there is. It's very strange.
All right, moving forward. Most people take Iskaral's ramblings for annoying, senseless gibbering, but I've got a lot of information from it. I think at some point he gives us the whole plot for Deadhouse Gates, but that's gonna be later. this time there's one sentence that he repeats throughout the books that fans have been wondering about since ever, so at least since I've joined. Everybody keeps asking this over and over and over again. One life given for one life taken. He describes Servant as a kind man with salty hands, one wrinkled, one pink. Well, salty hands because he's a fisherman and he's Absalar's father. The one wrinkled, one pink, I think he was missing one hand, but I can't really remember that.
He was.
And of course, it seems to fit nice with Absalar's life, which was taken by Cotillion, and then the life of her father, which was given back to her as an exchange. But I have this nagging feeling that there's more to it than just Absalar and her father. He keeps repeating it all over the place. So what are we all missing?
Oh well, there's multiple instances where that kind of exchange is occurring. It occurs among the bridge burners. It occurs, I think, in Memories of Ice. It definitely occurs between the fate of, Paran being given his life again, and one close to him, their life being taken away. So it's foreshadowing House of Chains. Yeah, and the thing is, you can use a character like that to just sort of, you lay out this motif, and he can repeat it as often as he feels like, and then you can go looking for it in the rest of the series, and you'll find it all over the place. It's repeated a lot.
All right. This is actually a difficult one, and probably controversial. Benneth and Felicin. I mean, we see later with Ublala Punk the myth of the large penis treated with humor. But there's this scene with Benneth and Felicin, the first time we see them in page together. He wants to improve her situation, and he even offers her monogamy, and he seems to really want to be with her. He's frustrated by the fact that she doesn't desire him, while on her own side, Felicin is thinking, it's hurting so much. Maybe once I get used to it, once the pain goes away, I might actually show desire. It looks like it began like interest, genuine interest from Bennett's side towards her, and maybe if things had been different, she would have been in a better situation. I mean, I know Bennett is not the ideal man, but after all, he too was a victim, he too was a slave. He didn't end up the meanest and biggest of the lot by having an easy life. There's a lot going on there, actually.
Well, yeah, there's a lot going on, but it's also a lot about self-rationalization, to try to survive in a horrendous situation. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of complicated sort of psychological stuff going on, but I would certainly suggest that they're both completely deluded if they think that something can actually be won out of that relationship, because it is so flawed from the very start. But then it's something that I think I held off on and touched on in the Carcanis books, with the prisoners and Wereth, one of the characters. So I won't get into too many details, but the notion of the idea that a flawed and potentially horrendous individual, on sort of their choices, their life choices, the things they've done, the crimes they've committed, is thereafter never to be deserving of being loved is a very complex kind of question. And I guess it comes down to whether you believe that someone is redeemable, or are they not. And the notion of, I think I had one character and she wonders she believes she doesn't deserve to love or be loved, given the things she's done. And that's sort of a kind of a question I was exploring a fair bit. I guess I haven't really mentioned it, but a lot of the stuff raised in the 10-book series sort of posed questions for me, and they haunted me to the extent that I was going to actually approach and address them in the Carcanis trilogy. And I think that's probably one of them. So there's, in terms of sticking to the close points of view regarding Felicin, I still stand by, what was written there. And I'm not there to actually, lay judgment upon either of those characters or any of the characters. They simply do what they do and they are what they are. And there may be consequences and there may be not. And so it's, I guess it's just holding as honestly to the characters and their internal mindset and internal landscape as one can. And then you present it and you leave it, and there it is. And readers can do what they want with it.
Because in reading that scene, I was thinking, Felicin, she's young and she's impressionable, and Bennett is powerful and he's described as incredibly handsome. And for once, I can imagine that he's done a lot of terrible things to become the biggest and meanest in the group, but for once he feels the need for love, because I suppose that when you behave in that manner for such a long time and you kill and you're always at threat, the need to feel human, to feel affection sort of things out. And for once he meets this young girl and he feels the desire again. It feels like a new beginning for him, a new possibility to become human all over again. And for her, an option to feel safe and be protected from being raped and abused and by everybody else in the camp, it could have been a new beginning for both of them. And yet such a small detail ruined it all, took this chance from both of them.
Well, I mean, it's an unequal relationship to start with. Its foundation is unequal and imbalanced. And I don't know if that would be reconcilable ultimately, but I don't know. I mean, I just left it that these characters were basically trying to sort of fashion something survivable, and basically defining their own reward system for the horrible place they were in. And obviously it's a subject that I wanted to sort of return to, not just in the Carcanis stuff, but I was just thinking now of Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart, and the African Warlord. That's a very similar situation to Bennett and Felicin. And but I from there I'm using the point of view of the warlord, and so I guess some of the questions that warlord is experiencing and the remorse and guilt and all the rest that the warlord is experiencing is a revisitation of the Bennett Felicin scenario.
This one isn't so much a question as perhaps feedback. It's about the special treatment that Heboric was given, the one usually reserved to political prisoners. And it's a powerful statement on its own. The detail that he was made to carry the carts of ore harnessed to one like a beast of burden, despite him being a frail old man, was, pretty brutal. But what actually touched me was the comparison with the oxen, because they were pulling three carts, and the only acknowledging to Heboric's humanity was the fact that he was allowed to pull just one cart. You don't, express an opinion on it, but just the witnessing of the scene was pretty powerful for me.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, well, I'm not, it's, you simply write out the scene, and I don't know, it feels as if I'm not in position to actually judge any of this stuff, so I'm just going to record it. And so I guess in that respect, the I don't know, I couldn't even parse the creative process and all this. It's just, in a sense, the writer wanders, the many landscapes of the human condition, and just moves from I guess one question to the next, and you proceed through your story that way. And various characters are there to pose various questions. No answers, just questions.
Another thing that stood out to me, and probably because of its brevity, was the exploration of the morality of science, and along with it, the responsibility of authors. Heboric states that limestone is formed from living creatures, and that he believes that Otataral might be the same. He says, Otataral, the bane of magic, was born of magic. And he adds that if he was less scrupulous, he might write a treatise about it. Felicity, of course, doesn't get the point, and she needs it explained to her. If mages knew that Otataral is made of magic creatures that have died, they might start experimenting in order to be able to create it. And that would mean kill creatures that have a lot of magical power.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't explained in so much detail. That's, me putting it head to head. Because all he says is that the bane of magic was born of magic, and he might write a treatise if he was less scrupulous.
Yeah. I mean that ties back into that notion of, trying to, the inventor washing their hands of how their invention is applied in the real world. It's convenient, but it doesn't really fly. So it's down to the I guess the ethics of the inventor. So that's kind of just Heboric providing his point of view on this thing. That if you were given the wherewithal to invent the atomic bomb, he probably wouldn't have done it. So
one of the most important lessons I got from the series is that to treat anything as a simple matter is an illusion, that life is always too complicated for any one thing to be just one thing. And here there's a short sentence that caught my attention. History comforts the dull-witted. Words attributed to Kelamved. I've seen how eager most people are to buy into history. At least my Romanian fellows buy into it, into the whole myth of aggrandizing our ancestor, and it's almost cult-like. And for those who don't know this, Vlad the Impaler is actually a national hero to us. He's not a sadistic monster. So, what do
no,
you think of
he held off the Ottomans, didn't he? By virtue of basically a terror campaign.
He was basically a short-lived ruler. He ruled once for about 4 years and then went to jail, betrayed by the nobility. Then a neighboring king negotiated with the Hungarian king who had him in prison to let him try again because he needed allies. And then he was murdered because he was sadistic. So all in all, he didn't rule for long, other than his reputation for being insane, he didn't do much. He
Yeah.
did win a few hard battles, but not enough to earn him so much respect and adoration here. But if you tell,
wasn't it his building plans, the fortresses that he built, that actually, you know, was kind of instrumental in slowing down the Ottomans.
they didn't get to build much. There's
He
actually
didn't? Okay.
one story that made him famous. The Ottomans came with an army so huge that none of the usual tactics would have worked. So he had 100 of his men picked, people who were loyal and who spoke Turkish flawlessly. He had them dressed as Turks, and then in the middle of the night, right before sunrise, he attacked the Ottoman camp, and he had them yell in Turkish that the Romanians are attacking us, they're dressed like us, kill them, kill them. They just charged through the camp, walked out, and the Turks killed each other for several hours until they realized that the Romanians were long gone. And after that, they had to pack up and leave.
Mm.
So he
Yeah,
was smart, but
it's pretty clever. Yeah.
anyway, this idea. But if you tell anyone that he was actually sadistic, that he didn't just kill the Turks. If you were a servant and tripped and spilled the wine, you would be impaled. And he had a sadistic pleasure in witnessing people suffering.
Mm.
They'll tell you that you don't know your own history. How can you say that our hero is a monster?
Mm.
And hearing these words that history comforts the dull-witted, makes me think about.
Mm. Well, again, it's versions of history as well, um, which of course is always open to revision. And I think as a general rule, if one sort of views some aspect of one's history culturally or nationally um, as somehow elevating that individual or group of individuals, um, it's probably wise to look at it with a little bit of skepticism, because clearly it's serving another purpose that's not just a recounting of historical events in the past. So,
Well, they aggrandize all of our ancestors, so that's actually worrying.
well, it's not uncommon. I mean, think Lewis and Clark. You know, they're iconic as American symbols of opening of the West, but they used Mackenzie's maps. You know, they weren't the first ones to make that journey. Um, and they followed on La Vérendrye's trail as well. So, but they serve a greater purpose in the American psyche in terms of their myth building, of the nation building. And that trumps any factual reality, such as it is. So,
I suppose I got lucky from this point of view. We had a real cool history teacher. She would give us the lesson the way she's supposed to, and then she'd say, "Okay, this is what Big Brother wants me to tell you. Now let me tell you what really happened, or at least what is most likely that really happened." And then she would spin two, three different point of views and information that we wouldn't normally have in the curriculum of what was
mm,
supposed to be taught to us.
yeah,
And I think most people are not even aware of the fact that history is very much politicized in the way it is taught in schools. People take it
yeah,
for fact, and that's why they hold on to it with so much conviction.
yeah.
Uh, this is probably a follow up on something I've already asked in Gardens of the Moon. No, Topper tells Paran that the Empress wants one arm disarmed, which is kind of funny. And Paran realizes that he's being asked to betray Whiskey Jack and the bridge burners. And since his loyalties have been challenged, he wonders if the Empress is the Empire. Now, that same theme is explored again in Deadhouse Gates with one extra step. Fiddler and Crocus have a discussion where Fiddler claims that Malaz isn't the Empress and the Empress isn't Malaz, to which Crocus responds, rather cynically, I think, but quite truthful as well, that the distinction is moot.
Mm-hmm. It's just it's the alternating points of view. It depends on how you want to, you know, visualize the reasons for doing things on behalf of, you know, the Empress versus the Empire. Are they the same thing? And that's one of the problems with personality-based rule, is that it is bound to that individual, and sometimes the needs or desires of that individual actually has no bearing on, you know, national or imperial needs. So yeah, personality cult stuff is always troublesome and dubious in governing, as we've seen quite recently. So yeah, it's just, yeah, alternate takes. I mean, a lot of Deadhouse Gates is actually about it. It's a discourse on history and how to read history, and so it's going to show up again and again.
No, I suppose it's also the idea of the empire responds to the commands of the empress. So if the empire conquers a nation, the distinction whether it was Lassine that conquered them or the Malazans that conquered them becomes moot. The way that the empire is seen is same as the empress is seen. They're one and the same.
Yeah, and it's basically the two views are the one on the inside of the empire by somebody who's a member of the empire, who then makes a distinction between the empress or the emperor and the empire. And the other one is the victim of the empire from on the outside, and they make no distinction because it makes no difference to them whatsoever, whether it's the scene or the empire, because conquest is conquest. So
This is actually something I'm witnessing in my everyday life because America's foreign policy is not very much liked, and I have a lot of acquaintances that think that Americans are bad people because America does bad things. And it always strikes me how the the blanket statements and the generalization works, because the everyday American is not Trump and it's not America's military department, and they're different things, but people don't seem to see that.
no, well, I mean, life's complicated enough, right? So you need, I mean, there's a tendency to simplify that which you are opposed to. It's I don't know. I mean, that's a rabbit hole I don't want to go down. It's things are so complicated in that respect. It's very hard to sort of separate out elements of it in terms of responsibility or culpability or I guess for me, education is kind of sort of the only potential solution to this, but education has been pretty thoroughly subverted for quite some time. So, and I think it's getting worse. So I don't know. I guess the more communication occurs, the more people get out there, the more their opinions and worldviews are exposed to alternate interpretations. I guess the better it'll be. I don't know.
And I think that kindness and empathy should be part of education because knowledge itself is empty.
Yeah.
um Fiddler, he notes that familiars are magically fused to their masters, and says Mammoth is dead, then Moby sticking around with Crocus was weird. And I know you were pointing to something, and I believe it's more than the fact that Moby is in truth a demon. it seems to indicate a purpose. He had a purpose for being there with them. So why did he stay? Was he already a servant of the Azath dealing with the soul taken, the diverse? Was he just using the group to in order to ensure passage to seven cities? Or did he battle the soul taken exclusively to protect Crocus and his friends?
I don't think I can answer that. I think it's one of those things where you just want to leave it open-ended and you can take any interpretation you want. Yeah, I think there's some things are just fun to leave and let them sit there. And especially when you're dealing with something like a demonic entity in the guise of a familiar. I mean, a lot of its purpose was for comedic effect anyways. And it has some fairly amusing scenes or scenes where, you know, it comes out of the dust or it comes out of the darkness. I can't remember which. After this, you know, you hear this enormous clash of two enormous beasts somewhere in the dark or in the shadow, in the dust. And then this little thing ambles out. I mean, it's done for visual effect. And Cam and I would do a lot of that kind of descriptive stuff when we were gaming. And so it's fun to throw in. And we didn't explain it in our games either. We always left that element of completely unknowable mystery that was just operating. It's always out there. And that was, I guess, that was how we entertained ourselves and each other with the storytelling. Well, don't explain it, just do it, right?
You can blame a girl for trying. There's a scene where Iskaralpus talks about his book collections in the temple, and then Mappo just shakes himself thinking that the priest trembles have a hypnotic quality. Did you mean that literally as in he had the ability to hypnotize people, or just simply the effect of his insane, boring rambling?
A bit of both. He is a high priest of shadow, so there is a certain magic involved in the deception, or rather, there is a god's influence at work when it comes to Iskaralpust. And the whole point of obfuscation and contradiction and babbling is that it lulls the listener. And once the listener is lulled and not entirely paying attention, then if the person is devious, they can slip in small truths here and there. And I mean, you're right. You know, Iskaralpust at one point, you know, lays out the entire plot. So, you know, it's just fun to do. It's fun to do. And so I'm playing the same game, right? I'm using Pust with his babbling in the same fashion that Pust's babbling affects Mappo. But in my case, it's affecting the reader. But the reader's not aware of it because they're skimming through Iskaralpust's babbling. But he lays out the entire thing, yeah.
So in other words, you just told us that you're doing it to us, and okay, I think I'm going to leave it at that for now because it's already been 1 hour 40 minutes.
Alrighty.
This is fun. It's always fun, and I tend to lose the track of time.
Yeah, me too.
Makes me think of The Mask. I think that's the name of the movie. The somebody stop me kind of line. All right.
Alrighty.
Then.
All right. Have a good weekend.
You too.